Well, we want to turn our attention now to the West African nation of Nigeria. For those who have not been seeing, a wave of protest has swept Nigeria today, perhaps a wave of more protest over the coming days under the hashtag in bad governance and also revolution now. So a lot happening in Nigeria, and we are very, very honored to have here on the show to talk about this by David Hundeyin, who's a Nigerian investigative journalist and author. David, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. And let me just start maybe with some framing. Perhaps people saw some photos of protests coming out, but what are sort of the proximate issues that have ignited this protest wave there in Nigeria?
So there are multiple issues. There's sort of multiple subgroups that have sort of coalesced into a bigger protest movement. But the basic underlying issue that seems to unify everyone is the understanding that Nigeria is going through an unprecedented crisis of bad economics, basically. To to put it in context, as at 2014, 10 years ago, Nigeria was rated as Africa's largest economy with a GDP of about $510 billion. 10 years later, Nigeria's population has increased, but Nigeria's GDP now stands at about $280 billion. So Nigeria's GDP has effectively halved in 10 years, while its population has gone up. So Nigeria's per capita income has more than halved in the space of 10 years. Already it wasn't a particularly wealthy country in per capita terms, but now it's at disastrous levels. To put it in further context, of Nigeria's estimated 210 million people, about 135 million are estimated to be living in multi-dimensional poverty, which is about 65% of the country's population. So to put that in context, there is no other African country which has a population of up to 135 million. So that 135 million of Nigerians who are living in multidimensional poverty, that in itself is a population segment that is bigger than any other African country. So there is a huge groundswell of public anger to tap from. This is then further complicated by the fact that the new government, which came into power last year, which, as you may or may not know, is very much a US-backed government, has made absolutely no attempt whatsoever, as far as it is possible to tell, to create any sort of dent in this sort of ongoing economic disaster going on. And in fact, it is very much the case that the presidency and the executive arm of government seems even more determined to act as if the good times are rolling. So one of the stories that has caused a lot of controversy this year has been the decision of the president to buy a new presidential jet. To put that in perspective, the Nigerian presidency already has the largest presidential jet fleet in Africa. Has a larger presidential jet fleet than many European countries. Bear in mind, this is a country with a per capita GDP, per capita income of roughly $1,500 a year, right? And at a time when there was a huge public finance crisis, an estimated uh, roughly 80 to 87 cents of every dollar made by Nigeria is going on debt servicing, debt repayments, right? And at the time of austerity measures, because as you know, Nigeria has also had to approach the IMF and the World Bank multiple times, and the Nigerian naira, that's the currency, has roughly halved in the space of a year in terms of its value against the US dollar. So about a year ago, it was roughly about 800 naira to a dollar. Now it's about 1500 naira to a dollar. And in the space of all of this, the president announces that his priority is to get a new Airbus private jet. The country then spends another 21 billion naira on a new residence for the vice president, who wasn't exactly homeless to begin with. So it then becomes clear to the people that it almost seems as if the government and the governed are living on two different planets, because on the ground people are suffering in a very, very real, very, very visceral way, suffering to the extent that even food, like actual nutrition, has become a problem. And something like 65% of Nigerian household income now goes on food alone, right? So that should give you an idea of just how serious this problem is. Like, this is not a like a hypothetical numbers problem. This is a very real problem. People are literally holding banners saying we are hungry. That's not a cute expression of discontent. That's a literal statement of fact. People are functionally malnourished because of how bad the economy is right now. And yet you have this sort of great big cavernous government which sort of sits at a great height and almost seems as if it lives on a different planet to the rest of the country. So these are just some of the issues.
Wow. I mean, it's really important to understand all that context, given the fact that this is a very close ally of the US, this government in Nigeria, and is often touted as the way that an African country should be. And I'm just curious, when we talk about what's happening in Nigeria, what has there been, I should ask it this way, has there been any perhaps influence or inspiration taken in what's been happening in the Sahel over the last year or so, with all these different movements pushing out, and new governments rising, pushing out the French and the Americans, and basically uh, trying to impose their own sovereignty on their countries. And obviously, Nigeria has been used by the US to kind of push back against that. But has any of those changes across West Africa influenced people's views about what they're able to perhaps do in their own country of Nigeria?
Absolutely, absolutely have. So specifically the coup which happened last year in Niger, which is Nigeria's immediate northern neighbor, has had a definite impact because I think prior to that coup, most Nigerians sort of thought of Niger as this sort of 37th state of Nigeria, not a very significant country in the eyes of most Nigerians. Didn't really understand how it was even a strategically important country in geopolitical terms. And then the coup happened, and the flurry of international attention that came with it. And then, more importantly, the fact that afterward, Nigeria has since become Africa's top performing economy in the space of in a situation where it ordinarily is expected to be in chaos. It's doing 11% economic growth, which that's the sort of economic growth numbers Nigeria hasn't seen since maybe the 1970s during the oil boom, right? So that is then sort of creating a lot of questions and challenging a lot of assumptions because some of the sort of successfully promoted assumptions in the Nigerian public space are that um, democracy, in the sense that it is promoted by the U.S. embassy, basically, is a precondition for economic growth and prosperity. Well, here we have Nigeria, which on paper is a democracy, has all the paraphernalia of a democratic state, has all the institutions on paper, has the Freedom of Information Act, has all the bells and whistles, even though functionally it's Nigeria is actually classified as a hybrid authoritarian state, not a democracy, but it's treated as a democracy, especially by its foreign allies like the US. And people are starting to realize that, hey, these assumptions may not actually be true because here, look at Niger, who we've never really thought of as consequential in any way. We've never really thought these guys are going anywhere, and all of a sudden they appear to definitely be going somewhere. You simply can't sniff at the fact that this is a country doing 11% annual economic growth. That those numbers are unfathomable to a Nigerian. So that definitely has raised some questions. And then, almost as importantly, the events in Kenya, which have happened or are still happening almost concurrently, have also had a very outsized impact because in both the cases of Niger and Kenya, even though the manifestations have been different, but ultimately it would seem as if the target of the anger has actually been sort of two sides of the same coin. So in the case of Niger, it's been a sort of direct response to perceived colonial um, interests and activities in the Sahel region. In the case of Kenya, it's been a response to the perceived neo-colonial actions of the IMF. And the fact that the populations of these countries have been able to so successfully, so visually, and so successfully oppose these things and have actually seen some results has created a significant amount of expectation in Nigerian public space that, okay, so if Niger, this sleepy next door neighbor of ours, has been able to do something, bear in mind that in the aftermath of what the things that happened in Niger, as you rightly said, Nigeria was used, or the attempt was made to use Nigeria as a sort of blunt force instrument to bludgeon them back into line. And that simply didn't work. Nigeria imposed some of the harshest sanctions possible for a country to impose on a much economically less powerful neighbor. Nigeria blockaded Niger's borders. Didn't, Niger is a landlocked country. They didn't have access to the sea. They were effectively cut off from global trade. Nigeria shut off their electricity, which was in violation of international law. Technically, Nigeria committed war crimes, you know, just to sort of bring them back into line. And at the end of the day, all this was to the net effect of absolutely nothing. The Nigerians are basically doing better than they were a year ago, as far as they're concerned, and are doing better than a significant part of the Nigerian population. And then the Kenyans were able to do their own sort of very visually successful um, uh, resistance action. So these factors have sort of very had a very outsized influence on the decision of Nigerians to come out and try to get something done.
I think this is a critically important point here, touching on the sort of geopolitics of it. And I want to, pick up on a point you made at the very beginning here of sort of this being a US-backed government. And I know your own investigative reporting during the election was very much at the tip of the spear of some important factors. And when it seemed like, you correct me if you think I'm wrong here, the US government was trying to help conceal certain information that could have had a significant impact on how Nigerians viewed the election and the vote. So talk, if you could, maybe about that specifically, but just in general, what the United States is hoping to get out of backing the current government of Mr. Tinubu.
So, for those who may not be aware, the current president of Nigeria, who came to power last year in the sort of heavily disputed election, that's the president of Bola Ahmed Tinubu, used to be resident in the US and used to be a drug trafficker in the city of Chicago. He was active between the 1980s and the early 90s, and he was actually identified as a drug trafficker and as a money launderer, working on behalf of a heroin trafficking ring in Chicago by the U.S. government. There was a multi-agency investigation involved in this investigation. So the IRS, the DEA, the FBI, and to a lesser extent, later on, the State Department and the CIA also got involved because shortly after his involvement became clear, it also became he had also started to have some involvement in Nigerian politics. So, from the point of view of the US, rather than simply make this sort of mid-level or mid to high-level drug trafficker, international drug trafficker, pay for his crimes, I guess it was more expedient for the US government to use him for the purpose of international influence peddling, because this is someone who was at the time becoming more active in the Nigerian political space. Bear in mind, the US actually has form for doing things like this. So you recall recently the former president of, I believe it was Honduras, was extradited to the US on charges of drug trafficking. The story that I think is perhaps less told is that during the time when he was active as a drug trafficker or as a president with ties to drug trafficking, he was very much a US ally, and the US was very much aware of what he was doing. It was not a secret to them. They have some of the best intelligence networks on the earth. So there's nothing that was happening that was a secret to them, right? And it was expedient to use him as a pawn, as a tool at the time. And as soon as he was no longer useful, then we got these headlines. So Nigeria is currently pretty much where Honduras was maybe a decade ago, in that it's being ruled by someone who is, for lack of a better term, an American puppet, right? A stooge, because this is someone who has the perfect sort of blackmail material being held on him by the US government. So um, this wasn't entirely hidden at the time, because the results of the IRS, the IRS leg of the investigation, actually had some documentation in the public domain, which I was able to get hold of, and with which I was able to establish to a very large degree of certainty that this person who was running for president at the time has been at the very least indicted for heroin trafficking in the US. But then it quickly became very clear that the US government was willing to do incredible things to keep this information hidden. So at the moment, I'm still in court with 6 different US government agencies. So the IRS, the DEA, the FBI, the CIA, the State Department, and the Executive Office of the US Attorneys. And there have been some incredible things that I have witnessed through the course of this FOIA lawsuit, where I've seen the US government telling lies in court to protect a foreign criminal. I didn't know such things were possible. It's been a real learning process, and as far as it's possible to tell, it's clear that the U.S. government, even from the wording of some of the privacy exceptions which have been used to prevent the release of this information into the public domain, there have been privacy exceptions that have been linked to national security. Somehow, it's in the national security of the U.S. to protect a foreign drug trafficker. Why and how exactly that is the case, I guess the US government is the only one that can answer that question. So basically, that's where Nigeria is right now. Nigeria is being ruled by a foreign criminal of Nigerian descent who has backing, or who at the very least, as recently as last year, had the backing of the US government. And it seems as if, based on that relationship that he has with the with the American authorities, he has been able to consolidate himself in power. And as you may have seen today, the sort of uprising against his very, very blatant misrule by the Nigerian masses has been met with incredible amounts of state violence. Usually, when a protest like this sprouts, it usually doesn't sort of go up in flames on the very first day. But today alone, which is the very first day of the protest, no fewer than 11 people have been killed across the country. It looks like it's only going to get worse. And so far, it seems as if, well, the interests of the US government um, do not really seem to coincide with those of the Nigerian people. So it would seem as if this fight, the Nigerian people are sort of, we're in it on our own, basically.
Mm. Well, we will certainly continue to follow it, certainly through West Africa Weekly and your own byline as well. David Hundeyin, thank you so much for joining us here on The Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.